follows the launch of our global human rights sanctions regime, which I introduced to the House in July 2020. And since then, the UK has imposed human rights sanctions on 78 individuals and entities involved in serious human rights violations, including in Russia, Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Pakistan, Myanmar, North Korea, Belarus, the Gambia, Ukraine, and most recently in relation to Xinjiang in China. Now we have an equally powerful weapon in the fight against corruption. As with our global human rights sanctions approach, the anti-corruption sanctions are not intended to target whole countries or whole peoples, but rather to target the individuals who are responsible and should be held responsible for graft and the cronies who support or benefit from their corrupt actions. So these regulations today will enable us to impose asset freezes and travel bans on individuals and organisations who are involved in serious corruption. Our approach is grounded in, it's based on the UN Convention Against Corruption and related instruments. It has a clear focus on bribery and misappropriation of property, and that includes embezzlement. Bribery is well understood. It's defined in the regulations. It includes both giving a financial or other kind of advantage to a foreign public official and a foreign public official receiving a financial or other advantage. Misappropriation of property occurs when a foreign public official improperly diverts property entrusted to them in their official role, and that may be intended to benefit them or a third party. For example, it could include siphoning off state funds to private bank accounts. It could include the improper granting of licenses for the exploitation of natural resources. But whatever the particular circumstances, at the heart of this, Madam Deputy Speaker, lies the same debilitating cycle of behaviour, corrupt officials ripping off their own people. These powers will also enable us to target those who are either facilitating or profiting from such corrupt acts, those who conceal, those who transfer the proceeds of serious corruption, and those who obstruct justice relating to serious corruption. And that won't be limited to state officials. For additional clarity in all of this, we've published a policy note today which sets out how we will consider designations under these regulations. And I know across the House there's always interest in the legal criteria as well as the evidence base that we have to accumulate. We will also ensure, and I think it's right to say, we will ensure due process and the rule of law so that the rights of others are respected. So those designated will be able to request that a minister reviews the decision, and they can also apply to challenge the decision in court, which I think is an important check in the system. Madam Deputy Speaker, as well as introducing the legal basis for this regime, today I can tell the House that we're also making the first designations under these new regulations, which include some of the most notorious cases of corruption in recent history. Each designation is underpinned by evidence and meets the tests set out in the Sanctions Act and the regulations. So today, I can tell the House that we're imposing sanctions on individuals who have been involved in serious corruption from 6 particular countries. First, we're imposing sanctions on 14 individuals involved in the $230 million tax fraud in Russia, perpetrated by an organised crime group and uncovered by Sergei Magnitsky. Next, we're imposing sanctions on Ajay, Atul and Rajesh Gupta and their associate Salim Essa for their roles in serious corruption. Those individuals were at the heart of a persistent pattern of corruption in South Africa, which caused significant damage to its which caused significant damage to its economy and directly harmed the South African people. We're also designating 3 individuals involved in serious corruption in Honduras, Nicaragua and Guatemala, including facilitating bribes to support a drug trafficking cartel. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are imposing sanctions on the Sudanese businessman Ashraf Seed Ahmed Hussein Ali, known also as Al Cardinal, for the misappropriation of significant amounts of state assets in one of the very poorest countries in the world. This diversion of resources, in collusion with South Sudanese elites, caused serious damage to public finances in South Sudan and has also contributed to the ongoing instability and conflict there. Let us be clear about this, Madam Deputy Speaker. Corruption is not a victimless crime. Far from it. By enriching themselves, these people have caused untold damage, untold hardship on the countries and the communities which they exploited for their own predatory greed. So today we send a clear message. Those sanctioned today are not welcome in the UK. They will not be able to use British bank accounts or businesses to give their illicit actions some veneer of respectability, because their assets will be frozen. And I can tell the House that more designations will follow in due course, based on the policy note as well as the legal criteria that we've set out and assessed against the evidence. As with all targeted sanctions, they are most effective when they're backed up by coordinated international action. And of course, that's particularly important when it comes to corruption, given the fluid, complex and global nature of modern illegal corruption schemes. And we will continue to work with our friends, our partners, including the US and Canada, who are equipped with the legal frameworks to take similar action. So today, Madam Deputy Speaker, I hope the whole House will unite and join with me in standing up for the values of democracy, good governance and the rule of law, as Britain sends out their clearest message to all those involved in serious corruption around the world. You can't come here, you can't hide your money here, and I commend this statement to the House.
Thank you. Lisa Nandy.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We warmly welcome today's announcement. We agree that corruption is a global scourge. It costs the global economy billions every year. It sustains rotten governments, protects the dishonest and the criminal, tilts the playing field against businesses who do the right thing, and it denies people around the world money that belongs to them, that should be spent on our shared prosperity, our healthcare and our opportunities. The absence of corruption, as I told him last June, left a huge hole in the global human rights sanctions. If you want to crack down on human rights abusers, you have to follow the money. So we are really pleased to see the government following the standards set by the USA and Canada in plugging this hole today, and we'll study the regulations and the policy note that he mentioned carefully. But I hope you can assure the House today that there will be resources to support investigations and enforcement. The current rate of prosecutions for economic crime is currently woefully low, as he knows. And to put it bluntly, Madam Deputy Speaker, if he's serious about what he's saying today, he needs to put his money where his mouth is and make sure that agencies like the National Crime Agency have the resources that they need. That he will allow Parliament to put forward names to be considered for designation, and as I pressed him last year, that he'll allow parliamentary scrutiny of who is, and crucially, who isn't designated, to ensure that there is no prospect or suggestion that big money can corrupt our politics and influence the decisions that are taken. This last one really matters, Madam Deputy Speaker, because while I welcome his words today, the mass of revelations that have come to light in the last few days alone have shown a tangled network of financial interests and cosy relationships at the heart of government that appear to send a green light to many of the very regimes that he mentioned in his statement today. We need to know that this announcement isn't just a gloss on the surface of a grubby system which underneath signals business as usual. Now, he mentioned Saudi, but can I ask him what message it sends to the Saudi regime when he sanctions officials implicated in the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, but then we find all it takes is for the Crown Prince to WhatsApp the Prime Minister to tell him relations will be damaged between our countries unless the path is cleared for him to buy a key economic asset in the UK, and instead of standing up to it, he deploys his top aide to investigate. He mentioned sanctions against Chinese officials engaging in genocide in Xinjiang. But what message does it send to the Chinese government when on Saturday we learnt that the Prime Minister could simply message the Chancellor to ask for Chinese investment into the UK in areas of critical national infrastructure like energy, and could gain access despite only having been 15 months out of office, despite it being in clear breach of the rules? And for all his admirable words about Sergei Magnitsky, the UK still acts as a haven for the dark money that sustains the Putin regime, with over £1 million in Russian-linked donations to the Tory party since the Russia report was handed to the government, but not a single recommendation acted upon to safeguard our country in all that time. Surely he can see the problem. On the one hand, he signals an intent to crack down on corruption and human rights abuses by causing economic pain to those responsible. But just down the road, those very same regimes can call up the Prime Minister to advance their own interests, even when those interests are at odds with the interests of the British people. He's used very strong words today, But while he is rightly pressing ahead with sanctions, he is either turning a blind eye to the real power relationships in government or he is being played. We deserve to know which it is.
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I start by welcoming her support for both the legal regime and the designations that we've made today. I agree with much of her analysis on the damage wrought by corruption around the world, and I think we're at one on that. In relation to international corruption prosecutions, which she raised, I think she makes an interesting point. Of course, criminal prosecutions are done on the criminal standard of proof, sanctions are done on the civil standard. And so I think one of the advantages, well, she's shaking her head, that's just a fact. And one of the advantages we have, one of the challenges you have with international corruption is gleaning the evidence in relation to it. And one of the advantages we have with the sanctions regime is it gives us more flexibility and agility to address the whole that I think she rightly refers to, that we are plugging. She also asked about Parliament feeding in its views. I think there's a role not just for honourable members in this chamber, but also relevant select committees. As with the human rights regime, we are entirely open to views and evidence, and indeed we will have to rely on that evidence in order to look at further designations in the future. She raised Saudi, but I'm afraid, Madam Deputy Speaker, she rather confused herself because the sanctions on Khashoggi were imposed by this government, remain in place by this government, so that rather roundly rebuts and repudiates the point that she tried to make, that somehow that the Saudi government was seeking to undermine the robust approach we take by political influence. So I think she, I'm afraid, rebutted her own point in that. She makes some good points about corruption, but I'm afraid she did rather tarnish her statement with a range of political mudslinging. But I would like to just address this issue around the government's response, which was published to the ISC Russia report back in 2020 in July. It sets out multiple actions that we have taken and are taking against the Russian threat. I've raised some of them in the House today. We take action on cyber activity. We've introduced a new power to stop individuals at UK ports and the Northern Ireland border area to determine if they have or they are involved in hostile state activity. We're introducing new legislation to provide the security services with additional tools to tackle the evolving threat. That bill will help modernise the existing offences. We've already implemented the NSC-endorsed Russia strategy and have established the cross-government Russia unit, which brings together all of our intelligence, diplomatic, military capabilities to have maximum effect. This sanctions regime that we're introducing today on corruption is an additional tool, and we will be working with...
I've already told the Honourable Lady to stop talking from the dispatch box while the Secretary of State is speaking. Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The fact is, the Honourable Lady, who agrees with us on this policy point, resorts to the mudslinging because she doesn't have too much more to say on the substance.
Now we go to the Chairman of the Select Committee, Tom Tugendhat.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And first of all, may I congratulate my right honourable friend. He knows how passionately many of us have supported his quest to put corruption as one of the sanctionable regimes. Indeed, it was the Foreign Affairs Committee with its Moscow's Gold report in May 2018 that called for action not only on those abroad who are corrupt, but also those who are enablers in the UK. And I hope that he will highlight to the House exactly where those agencies and individuals in the UK who are assisting with corruption could indeed be held to account as well. And I welcome very much the identification that he's given us today of Russian, South African, Honduran, Nicaraguan, Guatemalan, and Sudanese elements. But perhaps I could ask him for his second tranche to look a little bit wider, because we know that corruption is undermining the people of China. We know that the Red Princes are robbing the people and enriching themselves already. We also know that the Maduro regime in Venezuela has stolen off the Venezuelan people now for the best part of a decade, and before them, the Chavez regime did the same. And we also know that the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps has been stealing off the Iranian people for decades and continues to enrich itself off the back of a proud and independent people. So perhaps he could address some of those countries when he responds. But the last point I would like to ask is, While he has mentioned Russia, it would be good to hear him talk about those who are close to the Putin regime, directly assisting President Vladimir Putin in hiding hundreds of billions of pounds overseas. We know that there are many around the world who have used, sadly, our own markets and indeed other territories which are dependent upon us to hide wealth. Will he assist in exposing where that money is hidden and using these powers to hold them to account?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I pay tribute to my right honourable friend and his committee? He's campaigned for this. I think he's not only campaigned passionately for it, but he's also provided bit by bit some of the evidence, both for the regime but also for the focus. I take his points about further tranches and further designations. Of course, we'll consider all evidence that we've got, whether it's open source or provided by committees. He should feel free to provide it. He'll forgive me if I don't accept the temptation at this point to speculate on future designations, but of course we remain open to seeing all the evidence he refers to.
And now we go to Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I thank the Foreign Secretary for the advanced side of his statement and welcome any effort that's made to tackle corruption that robs societies of both money and resources needed to develop and deliver for their citizens. Targeted sanctions towards individuals and organisations involved in serious corruption is a welcome step, and the UK should never be a safe haven for those engaged in these corrosive practices. However, this is all happening against a backdrop of the Foreign and Development Office confirming it's cutting its own world-leading anti-corruption, open societies, media freedom and human rights work by over 50% this year. This is an abdication of responsibility that will allow for corruption and criminality to flourish in developing countries because of such cuts. Dr. Sue Hawley, Spotlight on Corruption's Executive Director, said the cuts, and I quote, could undermine not just the UK's stated aim to act as a force for good globally, but also seriously curtail the UK's ability to stem and seize corrupt money laundered through the UK's financial system. This government has used the COVID pandemic as an excuse to cut aid. And in many parts of the world, including close to home, the pandemic has been exploited by government officials as a smokescreen to conduct business dishonestly by fraudulent means and at the expense of human rights. Therefore, can the Foreign Secretary explain why he thinks cutting aid to combat corruption helps rather than hinders the sanctions regime he's introducing today? And what impact assessment has been made of these cuts to the UK's anti-corruption work? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, given the debate that took place last Thursday and the unanimous support of the motion calling the UK government to fulfil its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide in relation to the persecution of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, when will the Foreign Secretary return to the House to give a statement imposing global human rights sanctions on the perpetrators of this crime against humanity, not least the Chinese Communist Party Secretary Chen Quanguo?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his support for this initiative? He asked a range of points. I think it's a fair question about how we reinforce the law enforcement action that we take with our aid and development policy. He will know that we've got £10 billion this year that we have safeguarded, which leaves us remaining one of the global leaders in terms of aid. When we did the 7 priorities to safeguard and allocate in a strategic way, notwithstanding the temporary shift from 0.7 to 0.5% of GNI, one of the 7 priorities was open societies, and that includes our media freedom campaign, which goes from strength to strength. We do it very much in partnership with the Canadians, but the numbers joining that campaign have risen, and that gives us an increasingly broad basis on which to support precisely those journalists and media groups that hold the corrupt to account. I think, I don't know whether it was just a mistake, but he referred to sanctions in relation to Xinjiang. We've already imposed Magnitsky sanctions under our human rights regime in relation to those responsible for the systemic human rights abuses in Xinjiang. And of course, I won't speculate on further designations, but we always consider them based on the evidence.
Now we go to Alicia Cairns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome these important extensions to the sanctions regime and the sanctions announced today. They are a fitting tribute to Sergei Magnitsky and the work of Bill Browder, but also because they hit Putin where it hurts, the corrupt cronies who stand up his kleptocracy. But Alex Navalny is being tortured to death before our eyes, and if these sanctions do not result in the release of Navalny for medical treatment abroad, ending Putin's second attempt to kill him, will my right honourable friend continue to escalate sanctions against dirty money oligarchs and do so before Navalny dies in plain view of the world?
State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I thank my honourable friend? Can I also join her in paying tribute to Bill Browder, who was, of course, Sergei Magnitsky's employer, because he's campaigned for this not just on the human rights front, but the corruption front for many years. And I'm pleased that yet again we've taken a further step towards instituting some measure of justice. We are, like my honourable friend, very concerned about the situation of Alexei Navalny. It bears remarkable parallels and comparison with what happened to Sergei Magnitsky, who was allowed to have his health deteriorate in prison before he was then tortured and ultimately killed. And I can reassure her, though, that we have already sanctioned 6 individuals and the State Scientific Research Institute in relation to the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, and there are 14 Russians who are named under the new corruption regime that we mentioned today.
Thank you. We now go to Leila Moran.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's about time the government took further action to stop big money from figures close to the Kremlin influencing our politics. The Russia report made that need abundantly clear. But there are other ways of gaining influence in this country, like owning football clubs, for example. In fact, the review of football governance following the European Super League debacle may yet provide an opportunity, because the owner of one of those 6 clubs, Roman Abramovich, has been described by Alexei Navalny's team as one of the key enablers of Putin's corrupt regime. So will the Secretary of State speak to the Culture Secretary about ensuring that any future football regulator is tasked with investigating and acting on money in the sport with ties to corruption and human rights abuses?
Can I thank the Honourable Lady? Like many across the House, I share her concern, what we saw in relation to the footballing episode recently. Of course, given the strong lead by the Prime Minister and the Culture Secretary, we also saw a swift rowing back from that earlier planned initiative. She makes some interesting points about reform. We, of course, take those on board.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The measures announced by the Foreign Secretary are extremely welcome, underlining the government's commitment to tackling corruption and its toxic impact on some of the poorest people in the world. I wonder if my right honourable friend could reassure me that these new sanctions will work in conjunction with other measures the government's taking to tackle global corruption, including spending more, for example, to support open societies and help resolve overseas conflicts.
Can I thank my honourable friend? He's absolutely right. We've prioritised amidst a difficult financial settlement this year, the Open Societies agenda. There's £419 million going into it. I can't tell him the precise allocation country by country, only because we're quite careful not to do that, because it often gives those regimes and those countries tool or influence and exposes those charities, NGOs and journalists to greater vulnerability.
John Penrose.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also welcome these designations and this initiative today? This time, not quite this time, last year, the Foreign Secretary promised that he would extend the existing human rights sanctions to include corruption, and indeed he has done so today. This is a triumph, I think, not just for him, but also for other campaigners such as Bill Browder, as he's just mentioned. Can I press him, therefore, to say when he's going to be, whether he's going to be able to go even further, not just by designating more people, which I think he's said he has in mind already, but as he has rightly pointed out, the trick is to follow the money, and there are a series of measures, for example, to do with reforms to Companies House, which are being considered potentially for inclusion in the upcoming Queen's speech, which would make it dramatically easier for this country to follow the money, for him to make more designations underpinned by proof. Will we be able to get those into the next Queen's speech as well?
State.
My honourable friend is demonstrating yet again what a tenacious campaigner he is, because he's been lavish in praising others, but actually he has been one of the most thoughtful and ardent and tenacious campaigners for this reform. I will certainly take on board his comments about further measures we can take to really reinforce even further the global sanctions regime. As he knows, I wanted to make sure that we got this right legally, in practical terms, to make sure we don't give those corrupt cronies the PR gift of weak regime, or one that can be challenged in the courts. So we want to learn from the practice, but we will certainly, and I will continue to listen very carefully to everything my honourable friend says on this subject.
Christian Matheson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I join my honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, in welcoming the broad thrust of today's announcement? But it goes after individuals, not after the structures and the tax havens that enable this. Tax havens such as the Cayman Islands, for example, which is on the EU blacklist. Does the Foreign Secretary agree that the Cayman Islands enables tax abuse? And if so, what's he going to do about it?
Secretary of State.
I thank the honourable gentleman. He rates an important point. As I set out in my opening statement, we've taken a range of measures, including to address the kind of concerns that he's raised. Obviously, we're mindful of the constituent powers and constitutional powers of the relevant overseas territories, but nothing will stop us to take further measures and further action if we deem it necessary.
Now we go to Nazrat Ghani.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate and welcome my Right Honourable friend's statement to upgrade the Magnitsky sanctions to include corruption, and we mustn't forget the tremendous work of Bill Browder. Can I ask my Right Honourable friend that will these sanctions, new sanctions, apply equally to all individuals that fall short of the law? For example, will they apply not to junior but senior officials in the Chinese Communist Party who are implicitly involved in the abuse of the Uyghur and are living off the finances of Uyghur slave labour?
Can I thank my honourable friend, and again another ardent and tenacious and eloquent campaigner on this issue. She makes a really important point. We obviously want to be able to apply all the tools we've got at the most senior level. You're more likely to have effect that way. The challenge, of course, is that higher up the chain you go, the more indirect, I think was in her words, the links are, and the challenge is to make sure we've got the evidence. But we will look at this based on the seriousness of the activity and according to the policy note, which I'm sure when she gets a chance to look at it, will give her the reassurance she needs.
Now we go to Peter Grant.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State mentioned Transparency International in his statement. Last year, they said they had identified more than £5 billion worth of property in the UK bought with suspicious money, 1/5 of which came from Russia. And half of all the money laundered out of Russia is laundered through the United Kingdom. So does he not agree that any action taken by the UK to tackle global corruption will lack credibility until the United Kingdom government has put its own house in order by implementing in full the recommendations of last year's Security and Intelligence Committee report, including the tightening of rules on all political donations from Russia?
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? I've I think already addressed the second part of his question, but on the first part, in relation to Transparency International, of course, the United Kingdom is an open, outward-looking country. We want to attract direct investment. That's why, as I said in my opening statement, we also need to be on the lookout, eternally vigilant, to make sure dirty money or blood money doesn't drift into this country. We're taking the actions we're taking today precisely because we're serious about it. And I think if the honourable gentleman looks at this fairly, he will see that in 2010, when we came into office in this country, the UK was ranked 20th in the world for on the Corruption Perceptions Index. We've now risen to 11th, and we'll keep taking action until we're even higher up those rankings.
And now we go to Marcus Fish.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I welcome this statement and this extension of sanctions? Corruption is a thing that really eats away at the prospects of people in the developing world, gives them less confidence in the future, less confidence in their elected officials. But will my right honourable friend meet with me to see if there are ways that we can innovate to ensure that, for example, development aid money gets more directly to people to provide those social development opportunities, which can otherwise be diverted by corrupt officials.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. He's absolutely right. We give an increasing proportion, of course, of our aid to operate in countries via third parties, whether they're NGOs or other partners, rather than direct to governments. There's a case for both, for all the reasons that he suggested, and I totally agree with him that the approach to ODA should be a complement, a supplement to what we're doing in the law enforcement space, including through these sanctions. And of course, on any ideas he's got for fusing those two, making them even stronger, I'd be very interested to hear the ideas, and ministers would be, of course, keen to meet with him.
And now we go to Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And let me also congratulate the Foreign Secretary for this statement. It's a very important step forward. But can I ask him, if we look at a country like Belarus, where we know that the president is propped up by senior people in the military and the police complex, will he work with other interested countries, the Belarus's neighbours, but across Europe, so that in looking at the evidential trail, we're prepared to look broader than just what our own investigatory authorities can determine? That could make a material difference in challenging the Lukashenko regime.
Can I thank the honourable gentleman? He's absolutely right. And of course, in relation to Belarus, under the human rights sanctions, Magnitsky sanctions regime, we very much led the way. We instituted, I think, those human rights sanctions before the EU, but we were in constant dialogue with them about the names, the evidence and the individuals. It's important to have that systematic approach, partly to have more effect, but also to be on surer ground when sanctions are imposed. And Belarus is also a good example, as honourable members across the House have raised, of where we, at the same time as imposing those sanctions, provided extra support for civil society, whether it's opposition groups, not directly but through NGOs and through journalists, and support for media and the open society agenda that we've been talking about as part of the integrated review.
Now we go to Nigel Mills.
Thank you, and can I warmly welcome this statement and the measures announced today. Would the Foreign Secretary agree that there's a need to update the international rules and action to ensure all the progress we've made on tackling money laundering and the hiding of stolen money isn't undermined by the use of crypto assets such as cryptocurrencies, which are much harder to track as they move around the world?
Yes, can I thank my honourable friend? He's right. We need some international coordination. I think it works better as coordination rather than supranational institutions, because we want to retain some flexibility, and that often has been quite effective. I can tell him that we, on the corruption sanctions regime, we already obviously cooperating with the US and Canada. We did on the list of names we've designated today. Australia is also in the midst of considering a Magnitsky regime on human rights, and who knows, potentially in due course that may extend to corruption. The EU followed the UK lead in enacting a global human rights sanctions regime. They've not yet introduced powers for corruption, an equivalent corruptions regime, so we're ahead of the pack on all of this, but he raises an important point. It's not just what we do individually, it's our convening power, our ability to be a force for good working with others, including the EU, the US, Canada and Australia.
And finally, Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I also thank the Secretary of State for his commitment? He's Secretary of State has a personal determination, and we thank him for that. Having seen the effect of Libyan sanctions for those affected by terrorism who are American or German, in comparison to what has been secured for victims of IRA terrorism working hand in hand with Gaddafi, I believe it is past time that these sanctions are in place. What assurance will the Secretary of State give to the British people that government is now in the position to impose sanctions and see that the people affected can be the beneficiaries? And what consideration is given to widespread use of these sanctions in areas such as those involved in atrocities against the Uyghurs, the Christians, against the Falun Gong, against the Tibetan Buddhists in China, to ensure that businesses as well as government officials will feel the brunt and the pain and the impact of these sanctions?
I thank the honourable gentleman, and I share his determination to tackle this. In relation to some of the groups that he refers to, he'll know that we've taken action, in particular in relation to the persecution of the Uyghur Muslims and the use of forced labour. In relation to others, and he mentions Libya and others, I can't speculate in advance. What I can tell him is we have got the legal framework now. And we've also set out a policy note. He'll be able to look at that and feel free to come back and ask me further questions, which will give him a sense of how we will determine the criteria we determine. And then, of course, it's evidence-driven. And that often is the hardest part of it. But again, that comes back to the point of the importance of coordinating with our international partners, sharing evidence and sharing our assessment of individuals and countries where we can act.
Thank you. I will now briefly suspend the House for 3 minutes in order to allow arrangements for the next item of business to be made. Order! Order! We now come to the statement on the carrier strike group deployment, and I call the Secretary of State, Ben Wallace, to make the statement.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like, if I may, to make a statement on the forthcoming deployment of the carrier strike group. But before I do, I wish to send my condolences to the Indonesian Navy and the families of the ship's company of KRI Nanggala following the tragic news that the submarine has been lost. I know the sorrow is felt particularly strongly within our own Royal Navy submarine community, who understand the risks faced by their friends all too well. The United Kingdom stands ready to help our Indonesian colleagues in any way we can going forward. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK has a long history of involvement in the Pacific. This year we celebrate the 50th anniversary of our five-power defence arrangement between the United Kingdom, Malaysia and Singapore, Australia and New Zealand. Few outside military circles are familiar with this relationship, despite the fact it is Asia's most enduring multilateral arrangement, a partnership that has grown in scope to cover everything from humanitarian assistance and disaster relief to counter-terrorism and maritime security. A partnership based on common shared values, tolerance, justice, and the rules-based order. But even as the Pacific's importance to our future economy continues to rise, so the challenges to the freedom of navigation in that region continue to grow. Our trade with Asia depends on the shipping that sails through a range of Indo-Pacific choke points, yet they are increasingly at risk, whether from hostile state actors or piracy on the high seas. Madam Deputy Speaker, we have to be clear to any who wish to challenge our international rules-based system that the laws must be upheld. But our partnership gives us strength. Friendship is the one thing that our adversaries lack. We deliver a powerful message of strength when we show our solidarity. That's why in recent years we've begun returning to the East. The UK now has a persistent presence in the region through British Forces Brunei, a regional logistical hub in Oman, and our Maritime Component Command in Bahrain. But our carrier strike group gives us something different. HMS Queen Elizabeth is a floating piece of sovereign territory which can sail over 70% of the world's surface. It is probably the most guarded UK airfield you can find. It gives government unprecedented options to act independently against hostile forces on land or at sea for months without having to access bases ashore. It is a warship, a mothership, a surveillance reconnaissance ship. It is a convener of allies and partners, and it is a great projector of Britain's soft and hard power. Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK has a proud history of being a carrier nation. Those legendary Second World War vessels, HMS Courageous, Glorious and Illustrious, Ark Royal, Formidable and Indefatigable, are synonymous with the unquenchable spirit of our people. And carriers have continued to play a defining role in our nation's history well into the modern era. Those who recall the Falklands War won't forget the fundamental role HMS Hermes played in providing air cover for the vulnerable task force while 8,000 miles away from home. While our last carrier, HMS Illustrious, career spanned some 900,000 miles and took in service from Bosnia to the Gulf to Sierra Leone. British ingenuity has long driven carrier innovation forward, from the angled flight deck to the ski jump developed for the Sea Harrier. But our newest carriers provide a true step change in capability. You can only appreciate the sheer enormity of each vessel when you stand on its vast depth, as I did this morning. At 65,000 tonnes, HMS Queen Elizabeth and her sister ship HMS Prince of Wales are the most powerful surface ships ever constructed in Britain. Longer than Parliament and taller than Nelson's Column, she has a range of more than 10,000 nautical miles and can fly 72 fast-jet sorties per day. This is British engineering at its best, a supreme example of a national endeavour, built by 6 dockyards, Appledore, Birkenhead, Govan, Portsmouth, Rosyth and Tyne. A cast of more than 10,000 took part in the construction. Some 8,000 apprentices helped complete the major construction in almost 5 years. Hundreds of small companies lent their niche capability, and 90% of those suppliers came from the United Kingdom. But the carrier doesn't operate alone. She will be surrounded by a ring of capability. Type 45 destroyers, HMS Defender and HMS Diamond. Type 23 anti-submarine frigates, HMS Kent and HMS Richmond. And tanker and storage ships, Fort Victoria and RFI Tidespring. And we will also be accompanied by the Dutch frigate HNLMS Everston and the US Arleigh Burke destroyer the Sullivans. Our carrier's cutting edge is located on the flight deck with the renowned RAF 617 Squadron, the Downbusters, operating 8 world-class 5th generation F-35B Lightning fast jets, partly made, I'm proud to say, in Lancashire. While 815 Naval Air Squadron will pilot 4 Wildcat maritime attack helicopters, 820 Naval Air Squadron will fly 7 Merlin Mark II anti-submarine and airborne early warning helicopters, 3 of which will be fitted with the new Crow's Nest. An 845 Naval Air Squadron will operate 3 Merlin Mark IV Commando helicopters. Below deck, a company of 4-2 Commando Royal Marines will be embarked. While in the ocean depths, the Royal Navy Astute-class attack submarine will deploy in support. Madam Deputy Speaker, over the coming 28 weeks from May to December 2021, we will see our carrier group travel over 26,000 nautical miles, from the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, from the Gulf of Aden to the Arabian Sea, from the Indian Ocean to the Philippine Sea. Beside the full integration of units from the UK, the US and Netherlands, the Carrier Strike Group will operate with air and maritime forces from a wide number of international partners, including Australia, Canada, New Zealand, France, Japan, UAE, Denmark, Greece, Italy, Turkey, Israel, India, Oman, and the Republic of Korea. The deployment will see the units of the Strike Group visiting over 40 countries and undertaking over 70 engagements, visits, air exercises, and operations. Critically, these events will provide excellent opportunities for the UK to develop new and existing trade and political links, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Not only will we meet our commitment to UN-mandated operations in the region, but 50 years on from the creation of the 5-power defence arrangement, we will further augment our friendship by participating in exercise Bersama Lima. Meanwhile, units from the Strike Group will visit ASEAN partners as part of our commitment to a more enduring regional defence and security presence. And 4 major stops on the Indo-Pacific leg of its journey will be Singapore, the Republic of Korea, Japan and India, and will help tighten our political ties in the region. And late in summer, we will host our first Pacific Future Forum in Korea. Meanwhile, China is increasingly assertive, building the world's largest maritime surface and subsurface fleets. However, Madam Deputy Speaker, we are not going to the other side of the world to be provocative. We will sail through the South China Sea. We will be confident but not confrontational. More often than not, the carrier group will be in the Eastern Mediterranean or the Atlantic, carrying out our duties in support of NATO. As part of this deployment, our strike group will be in the Middle East, conducting bilateral exercises and engagement with our long-standing defence and security partners, confirming our commitment to a lasting stability. Critically, in Europe, our Carrier Strike Group will demonstrate the UK's enduring commitment to NATO alliance, the cornerstone of our defence, by participating on this deployment in NATO-level exercises such as Exercise Steadfast Defender. Not only will be the period of dual carrier operations with the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle in the Mediterranean, but elements of the Strike Group will support NATO missions in the Black Sea region, demonstrating that we don't go alone to deter Tier 1 power, we go as NATO. Madam Deputy Speaker, the contribution of the United States to the rebirth of the UK carrier strike has been immense, but our Carrier Strike Group will take our integration with our US partners to a new level. We will have the Arleigh Burke class destroyer USS the Sullivans providing the strike group with air defence and anti-submarine capabilities, not to mention a squadron of 10 US Marine Corps F-35B Lightnings, the Wake Island Avengers, flying side by side with their UK counterparts from the decks of the Queen Elizabeth. This is the largest air group of 5th-generation fighters ever to put to sea, as well as the greatest quantity of helicopters assigned to a single task force in a decade. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's been a year since the last Royal Navy ship deployed to the Pacific. It has been more than 7 years since the last carrier, HMS Illustrious, deployed there as well. And it has been more than 20 years since the last Carrier Strike Group deployed to that region. Our Carrier Strike Group intends to return to that presence. And as the crew of the Carrier Strike Group embark on their maiden mission, we wish them well. The threats are moving on, and we must move with them. In this anxious and insecure world, Fortress Britain cannot batten down the hatches. We have to stand up for our values and rights wherever they come under threat, not just in our backyard, but far from our shores. Our carrier strike group will send a signal to our allies and adversaries alike that Britain will continue to play its part in shaping the international system, not stepping back but sailing forth to promote our prosperity, protect our interests.
Thank you. Shadow Secretary of State, John Healey.